On New Year's Day in the year 1863, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States of America, spent the morning at the White House at a New Year's reception, welcoming visitors, shaking hands, visiting. But partway through the morning, President Lincoln excused himself from the party and went up to the private quarters, the residential part of the White House, where he and his family lived. There he went to his private office. Waiting for the president when he arrived that day were the members of his cabinet, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and so on. They were there for a very specific reason, to watch as President Lincoln did something he considered very important. When he walked into the office, he nodded to each of these men that was there with him, walked over to his desk and sat down. On top of that desk was one single sheet of paper. He had come to sign the paper and to sign it into law. It was the Emancipation Proclamation. He'd been carrying it around for months, waiting for a major victory by Northern Union armies before announcing that he was about to free the slaves in the Confederacy, the states that were trying to break away from the USA. He'd actually been carrying the important piece of paper folded into quarters, stuck into the hat band of his hat, that famous black top hat you always see him wearing in the photographs. Today, the North had won a victory. He was going to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. And by the way, it didn't free any of the slaves in the northern states or the states on the borders between North and South. A few of those border states still allowed slavery, but they'd stayed with the Union cause, the Northern cause, when the war began. Lincoln was afraid if he announced that he was going to free those slaves too, the people in those states might change their minds and join the Confederate cause, and he couldn't afford to have that happen. As he said to his cabinet that day, "I hope God is on our side, but I have to have Kentucky." Well, he picked up his feather quill pen, and he dipped the point of it into the inkwell and prepared to sign the Emancipation Proclamation into law. But he didn't. To everyone else's surprise, he set down the pen and he said, "I've been shaking hands all morning at the New Year's reception, and my hand is tired. Signing this is going to be the most important thing I ever do in my life, and if history remembers me for anything, it will be for this. I want to make sure my signature is neat and smooth. I don't want people in the future looking at this and saying, 'Look, the president wasn't sure he was doing the right thing signing this. See how shaky his signature is?' I want him to know I was sure." He waited a couple of minutes, picked up the pen a second time, decided he still wasn't ready. Set it down a second time. Finally, on the third try, he dipped the pen into the inkwell, and slowly, carefully, he signed his name. Now, if you ever see copies of any of the documents President Lincoln signed as president, he usually signed them A. Lincoln. He had a lot to do as president in those years. He was in a hurry. But for this one page, he took his time, and he signed his entire name, Abraham Lincoln, as smoothly, as carefully as he could. Then he got up and shook hands all around and went back to the New Year's Day party. Now, I've always wondered what made him so aware of that signature of his that day. But it makes sense. Remember, Abe Lincoln was born in a one-room log cabin in the forests of Kentucky. In that one room, probably smaller than your bedroom at home, lived his parents, Thomas and Nancy Lincoln, and Abe's older sister, Sarah, and Abe himself. One room, with one door, two windows, a fireplace at one end, and no floor, just the tamped-down dirt of the Kentucky forest. Abe's parents never learned to read or write. If they had to sign their names to some legal document, his mother was so unused to the idea or the feeling of a pen or a pencil in her grasp, the best she could do was to make a very shaky X on the line. Thomas Lincoln had taught himself to actually sign his name in a very shaky signature, and he could only do it if you gave him enough time to do it. Thomas Lincoln didn't believe in what he called all that reading and writing nonsense. He discouraged his son from spending much time on it. He'd say to him, "You can't waste time. You're a farmer, son. You're going to be a farmer. You don't need nothing to know how to read and write." Abe said, "Well, every few rows of the field when the mule and I are cutting furrows down into the ground before planting seeds, Pa, the mule needs to rest. And that's when I take out this book that I borrowed from the neighbor. I taught myself to read, you know, and I don't want to lose or forget what I've already learned." Maybe he was thinking about his own father and mother's shaky signatures way back in Kentucky that made the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, so aware of how his name would look on that piece of paper that day. But he signed it into law, and if you look, it's the smoothest signature he ever did sign.